Good evening, everyone. I want to wish everyone an early Yom Yerushalayim, and it's an honor to be here. I'll tell you where our story starts, and I want to thank Rabbi Shor for putting this together. We're not going to start with 1967. We're going to go back a few years. There was a study done in the 1970s. They said, who is the most recognized face on the planet Earth? You know who the most recognized face was? Muhammad Ali. And you know who the second most recognized face was after Muhammad Ali? The man with the patch. As you said, Moshe Dayan. Can I ask you something? How did the man with the patch become that recognized? The story starts really in 1956. Now remember, you've got a fledgling Israel. Israel's all of 9 miles wide at its widest point. And what happened? The Egyptians said, this mistake, this stain on us is going to become a reality because something that every one of us in this room participated in. And that was the first and the second Israel bond project. Who grew up buying Israel bonds? Whose parents, whose savings was Israel bonds? Do you know what the first two projects were? David Ben-Gurion came to America to sell it. No one actually thought, forget that they'd get interest on the bond. No one thought they'd get the principal back. Israel bonds has never ever missed a payment or been late on a payment. You know what it was? Israel was trapped. To the north, you had enemies in Syria and Lebanon. The eastern border is Jordan. The southern border is Egypt. How do you import-export? There was no deep sea port. So project number one was a 24/7 dredging project that we refer to the creation of the Haifa deep sea port. And project number two was a southern deep sea port, the Ashdod Port. Realize, Haifa and Ashdod didn't look any different than Jaffa Port, but this 24/7 deep sea project. Now Israel, which is producing the Jaffa orange, which is producing other things, can export on the Mediterranean to Europe. But there's an issue, and what's their issue? There's only one oil-producing nation on the face of the globe that will sell petroleum to Israel, and that is Iran. That seems strange to you and I today, but we're talking pre the revolution. How did Iranian oil come? Through the Persian Gulf, through the sea, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, into Eilat port. Well, what did the Egyptians say? We'll choke the Jews. We'll choke them for the following reason. If we can shut them off, and then the petroleum oil coming from Iran is going to have to go through the Indian Ocean, around the tip of Africa, around the Atlantic Ocean, into the Mediterranean, it'll triple the cost of petroleum for them. And that's how we'll destroy their economy. And remember, that petroleum came through a very, very narrow strait known as the Straits of Tiran. T-R-A-N. You're all familiar with what? Sharm el-Sheikh. Sharm el-Sheikh is the famous city on the Straits of Tiran. And the Egyptian military shut it down. Israel was in a real bind. With the support, not military support, but with the support of the French and the British, the man with the patch did something fantastic. He took troops. They go through the northern Sinai, through the southern Sinai, and they strike Sharm el-Sheikh, and they open up the straits. And the world goes crazy. The world that did not condemn Egypt for preventing Israel from having the rights that every other nation on the globe had, basic access to maritime travel and to maritime cargo. When Israel opened up in 1956, what was the response? Condemnation. The greatest condemnation came from President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the United States, who threatened to embargo Israel. The UN condemned. The world condemned the French, the British, and Israel. If any of you have a chance to read, I don't think it's the first thing you should be reading, but those of you who like to read, there's a book called The Pledge. It's a story of Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, in his last year of his life, He looked back at the 8 years of his presidency, and he acknowledged that probably the worst mistake he made was squeezing little Israel after what they did to Egypt. Now, the UN, who condemned Israel, worked out a plan. It was negotiated by a South African Ole to this country by the name of Aubrey. Now, you don't get too far with a name like Aubrey, correct? So he changed his name to Abba Eban. Abba Eban worked out and negotiated one of the worst deals in Jewish history. It was signed by the United Nations, by the United States, by France, and by England. And what was the deal? We're going to create something called the UNEF, the United Nations Emergency Forces. And these UNEF, they will be placed in the Gaza Strip. They will be placed in the northern Sinai, the southern Sinai, Sharm el-Sheikh and the Straits of Tiran. There will be no Israeli soldiers. Israelis will remove themselves and go back to the Negev and go back to Israel. The Egyptians will stay south of that area. And the UNEF will guarantee a buffer zone that cargo petroleum ships coming from Persia, from Iran, will be able to pass through Sharm el-Sheikh. And everything's going to be wonderful. 1956. Let's skip a few years. The year is 1964. Two significant things happen. Very much like today, the Iranian army, even the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, is not in a position, and they're trying their best each and every day with ballistic missile development, with the enrichment of nuclear uranium, and the attempt to build Iraq, plutonium, and ultimately to come to a bomb. Please God, it should never happen. They're not in a position yet to attack Israel. So with billions of dollars each and every year, they finance proxies, and they're fighting a proxy war over the last 2 decades against Israel. Who are their proxies? Hamas to the south, Hamastan in the Gaza Strip, which is funded, bankrolled, and armed by Iran, and the Hezbollah. The Hezbollah that we know has 120,000 rockets, funded, presented, and shipped to them through Syria by Iran. Now, there are tens of thousands of Shia militia from all over the Persian Gulf and all over the world that are nested in Syria. The miracles that we experienced last night undermined much of their munitions and much of their capabilities. But Iran is fighting a proxy war against Israel because they can't fight a real war. It's a very analogous situation to what existed in the 1960s. The Syrians, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians were not in a position where they could defeat the small Jewish army, the IDF. So they facilitated the creation. They funded it, they armed it, they supported it, of something called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO coming from the north, from Syria, and the PLO coming from the east. Now, the east was not Jordan. The east at that point was Jenin, was Shechem, because most of Judea and Samaria, most of that territory west of the Jordan River was Jordan. And the goons would come in. A mother would take her children to a park, to a trip, and they would abduct them and murder them. And what did you see on Israeli newspapers, Ma'ariv, Yediot Acharonot? All over the Israeli radio stations. That's all you heard about. The whole country was mourning. The whole country was traumatized. The farmer in the Galilee would go out to work on a tractor, and the PLO would come down from Syria and kill him. And it shut down the whole country. It was a war of attrition. It was wearing the Israeli community down. And they had to stop the PLO. very much like we have to stop Hamas. We have to stop Islamic Jihad. We have to stop Hezbollah today. And what did they do? At that time, the new prime minister, Levi Eshkol, he was a former, until he was about bar mitzvah, he was in the yeshiva in the Ukraine. His name was Shkolnik. You're not going to get too far in Israeli politics with a name like Shkolnik. So he became Levi Eshkol. Who was the head of the IDF? A man by the name of General Yitzhak Rabin. And they sent expeditions into Syria. They sent an expedition into Jordan. Hold that. We're going to come back to that thought in just a second. As well, in the 1960s, the greatest public work project, not only in the history of Israel, but if you compare it in scope in terms of the percentage of the gross national product spent on that, maybe the greatest public work project in all time. Hamovil Ha'artzi, the national water carrier. Israel at the time had one source of fresh water, the Kinneret. You could only live in a very limited part of this country. And most of this country, pre-1967, was desert. How are you going to be able to develop this country? So Levi Eshkol, who had become the Minister of Agriculture, came up with the national water carrier. And a piping system, a very magnificent, sophisticated piping system, would take the natural water from the Kinneret, literally through the length and breadth of this country, to areas in the Negev, to other areas that otherwise could not be inhabited, could not be worked agriculturally. And remember, that was the primary sector of the GNP, was agriculture. And Levi Eshkol does this. The Syrians, seeing this, say, we can't tolerate this. This mistake, this nightmare called Israel, is actually going to become a reality. And they started damming up all the sources to the Kinneret. They dammed up at the Banyas. They dammed up at the Chazbani. And Rabin, after the cabinet voted, sent in the IAF, and they blew up the Syrian dams. It was humiliating to Syria. No one condemned Syria for damming up the natural water sources of Israel. They all condemned Israel for violating the sovereignty and integrity of Syria. And as a function of that, and as a function of going in and stopping the PLO at different points, a dogfight broke out. Now, please understand, in the 1960s, the most powerful weapon in the Middle East was the Soviet MiG jet. The Syrians had MiGs. America had Israel had no American jets at that time. No Phantoms. You know what Israel had? 2 French jets, the Mystère and the Mirage. But the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, was trained. And a dogfight broke out. Damascus was broadcasting how Syria had shot down the Israeli planes. What happened in actuality? 6, or I believe 8, MiGs went down. For the first time in the Middle East, that a MiG had been shot down. And what the IAF decided to do, as the people were out in the streets of Damascus screaming and yelling, death to the Jews, the IAF, at a very low altitude, made hakafot. Everyone's familiar with what we do on Simchas Torah, right? The hakafot. So these people screaming and yelling out at the street look up, and they're watching a Muggan David. 6, 7 Muggan Davids doing hakafos. And they realized that their government had lied to them. Syria was humiliated. Go back to Jordan. Rabin sent in an expedition. See, with Jordan, unlike Syria that was under Russian support, Jordan, he played everybody, King Hussein, and he was getting American military support. So America would squeeze him every time there was a killing in Israel or an event. And what would he do? He would lock up the PLO for a week or 2 weeks, and then he'd let him out of prison 2 weeks later. And Israel was sick and tired of it. And they sent in a military expedition to clean out the hornet's nest into Jenin. This wasn't meant to happen this way. But the Israeli soldiers literally ran into, tripped over Jordanian legionnaires who were well-trained soldiers. And a battle broke out. And many Israeli soldiers died, and many Jordanian soldiers died. And it was an international event because it humiliated King Hussein, that he lost to Israel, that Israel came in and bullied him around. And of course, again, the whole world condemned Israel. While all of this is happening, let's turn to the south. The most powerful man in the Arab world was Gamal Abdul Nasser. Gamal Abdul Nasser was a masterful demagogue. His economic policies were dysfunctional. He was incapable in terms of domestic economic policies, but he was a military man. He was part of a coup that overthrew the king. He became the leader of Egypt. But his vision and his goal was not just to be the leader of Egypt. He had this notion of the UAR, the United Arab Republic, of which Gamal Abdul Nasser would be the head of. And he would give these fiery speeches. You can YouTube them. Now, Nasser would grease back and slick back his hair. He was a good-looking man. He had diabetes he never took care of, which he ended up dying from. But he was a good, healthy, strong-looking man. And he could go on 35, 40 minutes. And by the way, this is the 1960s. Very few people had televisions in Egypt. This was entertainment for the people. They'd come out to Tahrir Square. They'd listen on the radio. And after the Ganza Drasha, the highlight, always, the apex of the drasha was always what? The following two sentences. Because remember, it's like King Richard the Lionhearted. Every time he had problems in England, every time the people were about to turn on him, he started a new crusade. He had to find an enemy, had to find someone to take the wrath and energy of the people. So who are you going to pick on? The easiest target are the Jews. We will make this is where the famous phrase came from Nasser. We will make the waters of the Mediterranean red with the blood of the Jews. The sand of Palestine will be drenched with the blood of the Zionists. And everybody screamed, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And he would do this. And as he's doing this, and the people are screaming and yelling, and his speeches would be broadcast throughout the Arab world, the Syrians and the Jordanians, the governments of those countries, were furious with him. Why were they furious? You got a big, fresh mouth. Yeah, you're a big, tough guy. You're going to make the Mediterranean red with the blood of the Jews, and the sand of Palestine is going to be drenched with the blood of the Zionists. Where were you when the Zionists came and made a fool of us? When the Zionists came into our land and violated our territory? Where were you, Big Mouth? But they didn't call him Big Mouth. You know, the President of the United States, remember the famous Billy Bush interview? Well, it wasn't supposed to be an interview, but it was recorded. He talked about locker room talk. I'm not an expert in Arabic, but I understand if you don't like someone, there are certain female terms or female anatomical terms that you use to call that person. Not any different than the locker room talk of our president. The Syrians and the Jordanians started cursing him and started calling him all kinds of names. You want it on our back? You suffered no problem, and you got a big mouth. Shame on you. Now it's not so simple for Nasser, because now someone's holding his feet to the fire. One last piece before we start, 1967. When Gamal Abdul Nasser went to sleep at night, his nightmares were not about Moshe Dayan. You know who Gamal Abdul Nasser had nightmares about? General, remember who his partner was? Slipping my name now. The Egyptian general who had a love-hate relationship with. I apologize, I'm having a senior moment. It'll come to me in a minute. The two of them had a love-hate relationship. No, Sadat comes later. Sadat was actually, he was the one who was sent to Russia to work with the Russians on this deal. And what happened? Thank you. General Amir, thank you very much. Amir was a very smart politician. He put his cronies, people who were personally loyal to him, into every branch of the military. He controlled the military. So Nasser might have been the most powerful man in the Middle East, in the Arab world, but Nasser existed at the whims and at the desire of General Amir, because Amir controlled the Egyptian military. That's a problem for Nasser. So Amir says to him, "You going to take that? Are you a man, or are you going to take that? You're being humiliated." And remember, in the Arab world, kavod is everything. Kavod means a lot in their culture. And Amir pushes him, and pushes him hard. Nasser calls the head of the UNEF. We are now, I believe the date is somewhere around May 16th, 1967. He calls the head of the UNEF, and he says the following: "You've got 48 hours to get your troops out of the Gaza Strip, the southern Sinai, the Straits of Tiran, Sharm el-Sheikh, and the northern Sinai. 48 hours. And if you don't take your troops out of there, I will not guarantee their safety or their security." The head of the UNEF calls up the Secretary General of the United Nations. He was a Burmese, Uthant. Remember Uthant? One of the causes of this war. Uthant said, "They're threatening our soldiers. Leave. I do not want to see international forces being put in harm's way." To quote Abba Eban, when he referred to this, "What good is an umbrella if when it rains you close it and put it away?" The world was shocked because Uthant did not call the Americans, did not call the French, didn't call the British, didn't even call a United Nations Security Council meeting, the 4 signatories to this deal. You know who was shocked more than anyone? Nasser. He couldn't believe how they buckled to his first threat. He couldn't believe it. And they were out. Amir, who had been fighting a proxy war against Saudi Arabia in the Sudan, he calls up the Saudis. He says, "We have bigger fish to fry. Let's call a peace. We want to take our troops out of Sudan. We want to put them in the Sinai, because now we're going after the Zionists. We're going after the Jews." And the Saudis agreed and supported that. And in the course of the next 8 to 9 days, General Amir was able to take 84,000 Egyptian troops, some of them from parts of Egypt, others from the Sudan, and place them throughout northern Sinai, southern Sinai, the Gaza Strip, and of course, the Straits of Tiran, Sharm el-Sheikh. And they announced to the world, no Iranian petroleum ships will cross, no cargo will go into Eilat port. The world did nothing. The world did absolutely nothing. Here in Israel, it was a mess. Israel had, quote unquote, an army of 275,000 men. But that's a false number. Only 25% of Israel's army was a standing army. Israel relied on 75% reserves, miluim. You're talking about people who were fathers and husbands. You're talking about people who would come from Elohim every year, but had not done full-term duty for 6, 8, 10, 12 years. Every able-bodied man in this country was sent into the Negev. We're talking late May. We are talking as every day thousands upon thousands of Egyptian soldiers are moving their way north through the Sinai desert. We are talking a real mess. On an economic level, it was a free-for-all. There was no one to work. They had children delivering the mail. It was the end of the college semester in Britain, in the United States, Canada, South Africa. You had all of these young Jewish kids coming to Israel to milk the cows on the kibbutz and the moshav, to work in the makolet. And what were they doing at night? You know what they were doing at night? Digging sandbags and creating bunkers for the onslaught. Kibbutz Be'eri, which is on the southern border in the Negev, over 10,000 graves were dug in preparation for the slaughter. Here in Yerushalayim and in Tel Aviv, the parks. Get the swing set, get the monkey bars and swing sets out of here. They were requisitioned to be mass graves. Every moshav, kibbutz town, in preparation for their dead, were preparing graves. It was so bad here that for the first time in the history of Israel, the leader of the opposition, Menachem Begin, was brought into the cabinet. He was given a minister without portfolio. I mean, do you understand how bad that had to be? Begin, for the first 19 years, David Ben-Gurion never referred to him by his name. He wouldn't call him Mar Begin. He referred to him as Oto Ha'ish. For those of you not familiar with Talmudic terminology, that term, Oto Ha'ish, that individual, that great approbation, was ascribed to one man in history, Jesus of Nazareth. The second person to get that approbation in history was Menachem Begin. They brought Begin into the cabinet. In America, Canada, England, South Africa, France, never ever before and never ever since did the federations in each and every city raise the kind of money that they raised. You had young Jewish couples, they took second mortgages on their home and sent that money to Israel. It was a crisis. It was over. Their prayer rallies, fasting. This was Auschwitz too. This is the second genocide in less than a quarter of a century. And they're watching it play out before their eyes. The cabinet sent, who at this time had become the foreign minister of the state of Israel, Abba Eban, was sent to Paris, to London, and to Washington. His first stop is to Paris, and he meets Prime Minister Charles de Gaulle. And you got to love it when they start. Whenever they start with these first two words, you know you're in trouble. I know you people. And by the way, he lectured him with a finger, a lecture like you talk to a child. Don't you dare disobey my orders. If you shoot first, you will never see a mirage, a mystère, a spare part. You'll never see even a French bullet. Do you understand me? So Abba Eban said to him, you signed this. We didn't start this. We're not the ones who shut off for Israel the opportunity and the ability that every other nation on the face of the globe is entitled to. You're the signatory that enabled us to have this. You know what de Gaulle answered Abba Eban? That was 1956. This is 1967. What did de Gaulle mean when he said that? I'll tell you what de Gaulle meant. The impact of petroleum on the world economy and the fact that France was dependent upon Arab oil. The fact that Russia, the Soviet Union, had spent $2 billion on Egypt alone. Today, when you talk about military spending, $2 billion doesn't sound like a lot of money. Do you know what $2 billion got you in the 1965, 1966 when they did this? The Egyptian Air Force got 500 new MiG jets with Soviet military attaché manning those jets. The Egyptian army got 1,700 new Russian tanks. Please understand this. Egypt alone could have annihilated Israel. They didn't need the Jordanians and the Syrians. They had the sophisticated Soviet weaponry to wipe out Israel themselves. And a lot of that weaponry is moving by the hour further north in the Sinai on its way to the Negev. He goes to Britain and he meets with Prime Minister Wilson. Prime Minister Wilson is very nice to him, but he gives him nothing. He gives him kindness, empathy, care, concern, like a Teuton Bankus, as we say. He didn't get too much. His last chance is to go to Washington. Now, please understand, Lyndon Baines Johnson will go down in history as one of the great friends of Israel and one of the great friends of the Jewish people. Johnson, before he became the senator of Texas, who became the Senate Majority Leader, when he was a congressman, was very helpful in facilitating Jews to immigrate to the United States through Galveston Port, the Galveston Port south of Houston. Johnson was supported and loved by the Jews. Kennedy was no friend of Israel. Wasn't an anti-Semite like his father, that I wouldn't say, but he was no friend of Israel. The first time, to the best of my knowledge, that an Israeli prime minister ever met an American president is when David Ben-Gurion met JFK in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. And Kennedy said to him, "Stop playing your games. You have not allowed inspectors to see what's really happening in Dimona. Okay? Now, you're either with us or you're against us." Kennedy's big issue was nuclear proliferation. I'm sorry, the opposite, nuclear treaty to cut back. And he felt that Israel was hiding. It wasn't wrong. It was correct in his assessment. And he threatened Ben-Gurion with an embargo. One of the people that I interviewed a number of people for this lecture, was the famous historian, former Israeli ambassador to Washington, Michael Oren. And Michael Oren said to me, Professor Oren said to me, that he can't prove it, but many are of the opinion that the reason Ben-Gurion resigned as prime minister was he couldn't take the pressure. The threat of an American embargo over this, he had enough. Ben-Gurion had spent he was not a young man, he spent his whole life. So Kennedy was not a big friend of Israel. When he was assassinated, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, said the famous statement, "The people of Israel have lost a very good friend in John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But the people of Israel have gained an even greater friend in Lyndon Baines Johnson." Here's the problem. What was happening in 1967 in the United States? Exactly. Vietnam. Now please understand, the election the following year, 1968, Lyndon Johnson did not run for re-election. Not only because there's no way he would have won, whoever the Republicans would have had running against him would have defeated him. He probably may not have been able to win the Democratic primary. That's how bad things were going. America was in a mess with Vietnam. Everyone said to him, Republicans, Democrats alike, don't you dare. We're not looking for a second Vietnam. We have no way how to extricate ourselves out of Vietnam. You're going to go down that road? You'll make things even worse. No. Dean Russ, Secretary of State, was a good friend of Israel. We said LBJ was. Most in that administration had very good relations. And Abba Eban comes, and the famous meeting, you can YouTube afterwards. And remember, one thing about Abba Eban, he was never at a loss of words. I can tell you that. Eshkol, and none of the people in the government trusted him. Eshkol used to refer to him as the Galanta Nar. Those who don't know Yiddish, the idiot with a PhD. You know, he always said about Abba Eban, he always had the right speech, never the right solution. Abba Eban was a masterful speaker. But the problem was he thought a little too high of himself, and he didn't know, he wasn't necessarily a team player. He comes, and they tell him, and I'm quoting the President of the United States, you know, with that southern Texas drawl. You fellas shoot the first shot, you go it alone. You gentlemen, you boys, you take a hit from those Arabs, then you're on the moral high ground. Then you can justify us and we can supply you. But I repeat, if you shoot the first shot, you go it alone. So Abba Eban said to him, it was the United States who was the first of the signatories that guaranteed our access. We didn't start this thing. And Johnson said, we're going to try to do an international convoy of ships from all kinds of countries. We'll bring it through, and we'll also include an Iranian, a Persian ship with that. Oh, he couldn't help him. In that meeting, and I have to give Abba Eban credit, the Secretary of Defense, his name was Robert McNamara. And I watched an interview with McNamara from the early 1980s. We're talking 15 years later. And McNamara said to Abba Eban, he says, you know, we don't understand why you boys are all so uptight about this. We have intelligence on you folks and on those Egyptian Arabs. We figure you boys all start this thing and shoot the first shots. You'll be able to take them down. It might take you 2 weeks. They start, you're better fighters than them. They can't fight a sustained war against you no matter how much Soviet equipment they got. We figure 4 or 5 weeks you'll be able to handle them. Why y'all crying? It's existential. You're going to lose your country. So to Abba Eban's credit, he said back to him, with all due respect, with all due respect is like saying, it's a nice way of saying that. But you got to give him credit. He says, with all due respect, Secretary of Defense McNamara, it was United States military intelligence that assumed you'd be in and out of Vietnam with a couple thousand soldiers in a very short time. Hundreds of thousands of American troops, tens of thousands of American deaths, and you're still in Vietnam. With all due respect, Secretary of Defense McNamara, we don't have the luxury of you making a mistake on our viability and our existential ability to survive. Watch on YouTube the press as they interview Abba Eban coming out of the White House. The man was ghost white. And you're talking about Abba Eban, the most gregarious guy there was. It wasn't a pretty sight. It's bad. It's really bad in Israel. This period, this 3-week period, as you know, is referred to as the Hamtanah. The Hamtanah, the waiting period. It was horrible. And I got to tell you, who made up Israel in May and June of 1967? The majority of the population of this little country were Arab refugees, Jewish refugees from Arab countries. North Africa, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria. What happened to them about 15 years, 16 years earlier? Their sisters, their mothers were violated. Some of their relatives were killed. after living in these countries for hundreds of years, they left with the shirt off their back. They were traumatized. They understood Arabic. That was their first language. They're listening on the radio to Gamal Abdel Nasser's speeches in Arabic about what they're going to do to the Jews. Who else is in this country in 1967? Exactly. The Sheris HaPleta, the survivor community. From a town in Latvia, a Riga, a Dvinsk, 4 out of 100 survived. 1 out of a family of 150. From Lithuania and Ukraine, the same numbers. From Poland, 9 out of 100 survived. You could have been from a family somewhere in Galicia where you're the only survivor of 30 first cousins, not to mention you lost your grandparents, your younger siblings, your parents. If you're Hungarian, so 1 out of 2 survived. What do you think happened here? Between the Sephardic Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews, this nation was in a state of trauma. And there was one group. I'll tell you how bad it got. The chief rabbi, Rav Unterman, he took out of his own funds, he had full-page ads in the newspapers. Al tityaesh. Don't give up hope. He quoted the verse we say, Psalm 20, Lam Natseach. Eile varecha ve'eile vasusim v'anachnu b'shem Adoshem nazkir. Don't give up. Didn't work. One group was not in a state of paralysis. One group was optimistic, and that was the general staff. And before we get to Moshe Dayan, he's not in the picture yet, and we'll see why he came into the picture. The general staff was furious. They were furious! And they with a lack of respect, they went after Eshkol. Take the handcuffs off! Take the handcuffs off! Every day you sit here, and General Amir's bringing more troops and more tanks. And we're sitting here, and the nation is dying of depression. We have a plan. You let us fight! What was the plan they were referring to? In 1964, 3 years earlier, and think about this in your business. We do this at the OU. We do strategic planning. You do this in your business. What happens if you lose your top supplier or your best client? What does that do to your ability to survive? What happens if the price of energy goes up this much or the cost of this supply? So you do strategic planning. What happens if because of technology this market shuts down? All these kind of questions. The general staff 3 years earlier, they said, what is a worst case scenario? What is the worst case scenario? Could Israel survive it? And they said, you know what a worst case scenario would be? The Syrians attack from the north, Egyptians from the south, and the Jordanians from the east. Could we survive a war on all 3 fronts? And the answer was, no, unless we do the following. And this is known as Mivtza Sadan, Operation Anvil, Operation Hammer. What is Mivtza Sadan? It was predicated upon one principle: a preemptive strike by the Israeli Air Force to take out the Egyptian Air Force. If we could do that, take out the Russian MiGs, remember, the Russian MiG is the most powerful weapon, we said, in the whole Middle East. But a Russian MiG that can't get off the ground is impotent. That was the whole basis of it. And the general staff is saying, let us fight! You know the 10,000 graves you dug in Kibbutz Be'eri? Why don't you dig 100? The 200,000 won't be enough. Every day you sit here on your hands, we are in a worse position. What was Eshkol's response to them? Remember one thing. Eshkol, we said, grew up in the Ukraine. He was in Eastern Galiciana. He thought in Yiddish. And his first language was Yiddish. He was fluent in Hebrew, but his first language was Yiddish. Grosse Chachamim, he says to the generals. Grosse Chachamim. Let me ask you something. You're big, tough guys, right? What did de Gaulle say? Not only would he not sell us parts, he wouldn't sell us a single bullet. What did Johnson say? Let me ask you something, huh? You're going to big, tough guys, you big Israeli macho men, yeah. You're going to do this and you're going to do that. And what happens when we run out of mortar shells? Do you know better than I do what kind of reserves we have? And we run out of bombs for our aircraft. And we run out of bullets for our guns. What are we going to shoot? A pea shooter? A squirt gun? Oh yeah, that'll be great. Because no one's going to supply us with anything. We'll defend ourselves against the Arabs with a squirt gun. You're going to sit here. And remember, this is the very same calculation that was done in 73 with an opposite conclusion. And that was what he responded back to them. And they were furious with him. Furious. The cabinet, his advisors said to him, the people are dying. They're chalishing away. You got to get up. You got to address the nation. You have to be mechazek. The people think we're going to be slaughtered. This is Auschwitz too. So they came up with a speech. Now remember, this is 1967. It's not today. The speechwriters, they're always tweaking and correcting the speech. So today you sit with a computer, you delete this word, you add this, you make this change. They're crossing out this. They're putting in those little triangles, add this word, and they're doing this up to the speech. It's going to be a live broadcast to the nation. Levi Eshkol has not slept in the last 10 nights. He's got a cold, he's sick, he's wheezing. He can't read the speech. They give him the speech to address the nation. And he's wheezing and he can't read, get it out. Instead of strengthening the nation, I don't mean to be funny, but the people said, this gross Shlamia, we're all dead. We might as well start saying Kaddish now. With this is our leader, we're dead. It backfired. They had to do something that no one in the cabinet wanted. The general staff didn't want it, the cabinet didn't want it. They had no choice. Because the people had lost confidence in their government, and it was a mess. They had to bring in the devil himself. The devil who had created the Rafi party, who was out of government, the man with the patch, Moshe Dayan. He was the smartest guy in the room. He was a chess player. You never knew how he was playing you or what he was thinking. You talk about Harvey Weinstein, you could give Mafter Yonah compared to Moshe Dayan. He's a Boy Scout compared to Moshe Dayan. Dayan and his friends, they raided the antiquities. His buddy, they had a shop set up in London where they would sell the antiquities that he raided. This guy was a character. But he was a chess player, and the people didn't know the real Moshe Dayan, but they revered him, and they respected him. And if we make him the Secretary of Defense, it'll be mechazik the people. And they did it. Dayan agreed with Levi Eshkol. We're not in a position to start a fight. No one's going to arm us. But he comes in, and the people start to get their strength back. They start to get their vigor back. Not because factually anything changed, but psychologically. They can't go on. All the American promises of a convoy, it never happened. Because none of the other countries wanted to have their ships be shot at by the Egyptian military as they're going through Sharm el-Sheikh. Didn't happen. Nothing. One last chance. They don't trust Abba Eban because he never follows orders. He always knows better. They sent the head of the Mossad, who had a good relationship with the heads of the CIA, sent him to New York. It's the weekend of June 2nd and 3rd. Friday Shabbos, June 2nd, 3rd. He meets with President Johnson. Johnson says the exact same thing to him, word-wise. If you shoot the first shot, you go it alone. But it's the way Johnson said it. To quote Michael Oren, when he said it to Abba Eben 2.5 weeks ago, he said it like a red light. Don't do it. When he said it today, June 2nd, 3rd, it was like a yellow light. He said the words, but he knew America, they had waited. They had given America every chance to try to resolve this. And no one was there for Israel. Israel was all alone. And even though he couldn't support him and back him, he had to say it. And when he left, the cabinet who was with Johnson at the time, they all said, they're going to preempt. Those Israelis, look, you can't blame them. We let them down. He comes back to Israel, flies it directly. The cabinet meets. They're getting no help. The situation's only getting worse. Operation Mccade, which is the first step of Mivtza Tzadan, is going to take place, depending if you're Ramat David in the Galil or if you're the Air Force Base in the south. It will take place at 7:10 and 7:15 Monday morning, June 5th. Why? The first nace that we are about to observe this weekend is the nace of military intelligence. What do I mean? Israel knew the following. The Egyptian Air Force, 6:45 or so, they would do their sorties. They would take off. By 7:20, they were back. The frum ones would pray. They would do the shacharis, the Allah, the thing. The not so frum ones would go start fressing right away. They'd be in the mess hall. The frum ones, they didn't daven as long. They don't have as long a psukkah as Zimmer as we do. After they prayed, they would be eating. By 7:30, they're all sitting in a mess hall. And the MiGs are sitting there by themselves on the tarmac. Listen to this. This was a suicide mission. I repeat, this was a suicide mission. With the exception of 12 planes, every Israeli jet, every Mister and Mirage flew under radar. Number one, radio silence. Number two, under radar. Most of them went along the Mediterranean. Some would go through the Jordanian hills, through southern Jordan. The goal, we're going to take out every landing strip of every Air Force base with the exception of Sharm el-Sheikh, so we can land our own troops on that landing strip. Every landing strip of every Air Force base, I don't care how far south in Egypt it is. It's a suicide mission because there's nothing left to defend the country. It's the only way we can win this war. They take off. Miracle number 2. At this point, I skipped that point, but King Hussein of Jordan comes in a publicized with all the cameras with his gun and hands his gun to General Amir on the tarmac in Cairo, saying that there is now a united Arab Republic. The Jordanian forces are under the lead of General Amir, and we join together with he hated Gamal Abdel Nasser, but not for this purpose. When it comes to a Jew, we love each other, right? We're going to join forces with Nasser. The Jordanians knew that Israeli intelligence was listening in. So they had codes between the Egyptians and the Jordanians. Every Saturday you're supposed to change the code. The Jordanians changed the code. The Egyptians didn't. The Jordanians saw the Israeli jets going through Jordan south to Egypt. They called the Egyptians. They sent the codes in. Didn't mean anything because the Egyptians were working on last week's codes. Every airstrip was taken out. Every Air Force tower was blown up, and they even had the ability to take out the Soviet, like they have the S-300s in Iran and the S-300s in Syria now. the equivalent, I think it was called, they're called SAMs, surface-to-air missiles. They stop, enemy aircraft. They took those out as well. This is amazing. During the Hamtanah, instead of what should have been a 26 to 30 minute time, every time a Mystere or Mirage would come back to refuel the plane, to rearm the plane with bombs, because they didn't have enough bombs to blow up the MiGs. They had to take out the aircraft. The landing strips. Once you take out the landing strips, the MiGs can't do anything. Amir was up in a plane. He had no place to land. They had to land at Cairo International Airport. His military plane, because there was no place to land. I'm not joking. What happened? They'd been training for 3 weeks. They had it down to 7.5 to 8 minutes per aircraft for the pilot to land in Ramat David or in the southern base, refill with fuel, rearm it, 8 minutes, and you're off! They went a second time. This time, it's like target practice. Boom, boom, boom. They picked off those MiGs on the airport. They're sitting there like dead ducks, waiting to be picked off. The Egyptian Air Force was essentially obliterated by 9:30 Monday morning. They called General Gavish, he's still alive, 92 years old. Ariel Sharon led one tank corps, others led other tank corps. The land war must start now. They move. These ones into the Gaza Strip. These ones to the northern Sinai. This under the southern Sinai. And if you look in Michael Oren's book, 6 Days of War, you'll see the whole strategy. Israel's got tanks. It's got soldiers. It's got half-tracks that are being backed by an air force. Even though the Egyptian army is much more in terms of manpower, much more in terms of tank power, they got no air force to back them. And the Israeli aircraft, now for the third run, boom, boom, boom. Those tanks are sitting out there in the Sinai desert like target practice, like dead ducks, and we pick them apart. And the land war is moving forward. Stop a second. Everyone's down there. We've got a whole plan. 3 weeks we've been preparing and practicing, and now it's happening. Levi Eshkol, through two offices, the United States of America and General Bull, who was no fan of Israel, the United Nations High Commissioner. You know Armona Netziv? Right, Has Promenade, Armona Netziv? That's where General Bull's office was. Through the UN and through the United States, they reached out to King Hussein because Israel was listening to the communication. Israeli intelligence was hearing the communication between Nasser and King Hussein. Guess what Nasser told them? Our troops are in the Negev. By this afternoon, we're going to be in Beersheba. Tomorrow we will have Al-Quds. You better join us. You come in with your troops that are now under my command, and you're going to join me, and we'll conquer Al-Quds together. Eshkol's saying he's lying to you. It's not true. He has no air force. His tanks, his army is being slaughtered. Don't believe him. We have no fight with you. We have no issue with you. Don't believe him. Nasser's calling. This time he's screaming at him. How come your troops are not moving? You should be joining us. If you don't join us, when I'm through with the Zionists, I'll come after you. First will be Al-Quds, then will be Amman. He's screaming at him. Where are you? You're part of my done. Eshkol, second time. I'm begging you. We have no fight with you. Please don't. He's lying to you. You're King Hussein. Who are you going to believe? A stinking Jew? Or your fellow Muslim? He believed his fellow Muslim. You want to conquer Jerusalem? Remember, Jerusalem is split in half. It's barbed wire down the middle. The eastern half is Jordan. The western half is Israel. You know how you conquer the western half? There are 2 high points. And you're all familiar with those 2 high points. Armona Netziv, Has Promenade to the south. Har HaTzofim, Mount Scopus, where the empty Hebrew University is, to the north. 10:15 a.m., Monday morning, June 5th. The Jordanian soldiers attack Armon HaNetziv, try to conquer it. 10:30 a.m., Monday morning, June 5th. The Jordanian soldiers attack Har HaTzofim. All we had in Jerusalem were fathers and husbands, miluimnikim, reservists, because everybody else was down where? In the Negev. They had the 55th Brigade of Paratroopers under Matagur, that was the center of the city, the Harel Brigade and the Jerusalem Brigade. But these were all reservists. The Harel Brigade and the Jerusalem Brigade, these guys might have been in their late 20s, early 30s, but they could fight. They defeated the Jordanians. They conquered Armon HaNetziv to the south, and they conquered Har HaTzofim to the north. Monday night, starting at 7:30 p.m., was the bloodiest battle of Yerushalayim. You all know what I'm talking about. Givat HaTachmoshet, Ammunition Hill. We lost 37 men, 37 fathers and husbands in that battle. The Jordanians fought valiantly. It was a bloodbath in those trenches, and you've all been there. You know, of the 788 Jews who were killed in the Six-Day War, the largest number of deaths were here in Jerusalem. We lost 182 fighting for Yerushalayim. 182 of the 788 were lost here. And the story of each and every one of them, you can see it, Givat HaTachmoshet. The JNF did a very nice job. They fixed it up. It's a very respectful memorial to them. By 2:30 a.m., it's now Tuesday morning, we have Armon HaNetziv. Please understand the following. Unlike the war in the south, where they had maps, they had a strategy, and as long as you can take out the Egyptian Air Force, you got a shot. They don't have maps. They don't know the streets of East Jerusalem. These guys, you know what they did? The first guy threw himself on the barbed wire. The other guys climb over him. The first guy, there's a sniper. They don't know where the sniper is. The first guy knows that he is target practice. He comes around the corner. He takes the bullet. He takes the hit. So that way the second and third guys will see where the sniper is and they can get the sniper. This was neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street. They conquered Rockefeller Museum. By Tuesday afternoon, they had conquered everything except the Ir Atikah. I apologize what I said. It was actually late Tuesday morning. Moshe Dayan said, I'm not starting World War III. I've got a two-tiered war. I got a war to the south with the Egyptians. I got a war to the east with the Jordanians. I am not starting World War III. We're going to go into Temple Mount, right? Instead of having 2 Arab nations, we'll have 20 Arab nations after us. Oh, that's great. We're going to have a gunfight in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? We'll have the Vatican, we'll have every Christian nation after us. They'll be furious. 2 men. Menachem Begin and Yigal alone. 2 men. They came in the afternoon, and they came into Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. And they gave it to him. You know better. We don't expect different from Dayan. Dayan is a great Zionist. Dayan has no sense of Jewish history. He doesn't appreciate what Yerushalayim is. He doesn't appreciate Har HaBayit. We don't expect different from him. But you know better. You know better. So in the language of Begin, God is giving you an opportunity to correct 2,000 years of Jewish history. For 2 millennia we've been refugees. We have not had our city, our holy city. Alon didn't speak in terms of religion. Alon spoke in terms of Jewish history. He said it's being given to you on a magash shel kesef, on a silver platter. And history will never forgive you, Alon said to him. Eshkol Because Dayan didn't want this. He thought the United Nations is going to shut this down. The Russians are going to shut us down. I don't need this. Eshkol called an emergency meeting of the Security Cabinet, 7 a.m. Wednesday morning, June 7th. The next morning, 7 a.m. You know where they met? In the bomb shelter of the Knesset, because the Jordanians were still lobbing mortars trying to blow up the Knesset. So they took the cabinet into the Klita, and they voted. And Dayan sees he's going to lose the vote. Dayan was such a character. He flipped because he didn't want to be on the losing side of that vote. He flipped. Yep, we're going in. And you all know the story. Dayan is sitting up there on Har HaTzofim with the binoculars. Colonel Mutagur and these guys, the 55th Brigade of Paratroopers of Tzanchanim, who had lost many of their friends. Rabbi Goren heard on Monday that the war had broke out for Yerushalayim. He was in the Gaza. He told his driver, turn around, the Jeep, we're going. Rabbi Goren was the chief rabbi of Tzahal. We're going to Jerusalem. Their Jeep was shot. His driver actually died from the wounds. Goren himself drove the Jeep back to Yerushalayim. He went to the house of his father-in-law, the famous Nazir, David Cohen, was a student of Rav Kook. He got the chauffeur. Goren was he was a killer. I mean, he was a lion, but he was a short guy. He had to climb up and get the chauffeur. Brought his father-in-law with. By the way, if you've been in Netiv Aryeh, Yeshivat Netiv Aryeh, you can see the chauffeur, the famous chauffeur that was blown at the Kotel on Wednesday, June 7th. So what happens? He's with them. Yerushalayim had been conquered in history 37 times. This was the 37th time in history Jerusalem was conquered. 35 of the 37, it was conquered from the north. The most famous, is from Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Bavel conquered it from the north. This was only the second time in all of history Yerushalayim was not conquered from the north. Shar Arayot. The paratroopers, right? Uzi Narcus was with them. They blew open the gate. There were a few Jordanian snipers, but basically it was white flags. They asked the Arabs, where's Har HaBayit? They're looking at what's Har HaBayit. So a couple of guys knew Arabic. Harim al-Sharif, where's Harim al-Sharif? They take him up to the Temple Mount. Now, these guys on Tuesday, an elderly woman came to them. It looked like she had a shmata. What is this? She's crying to them. She says, my family lived for generations in Yerushalayim. She says, we were the last Jews thrown out by the Jordanians. I had a brother who was wounded. We left. We couldn't take anything. All I took was this homemade flag. And I pray to God 3 times a day. He should return our family and our nation and our people to our holy city, to our homeland. She says, boys, please take this flag. And if Hashem gives you success, fly this flag back in our home. You know the famous picture up there on the Temple Mount with the flag? You know the real story behind it? So they ask Harim al-Sharif, the Arabs take him up there. They put up the flag. And the most famous words in all of modern Jewish history, exactly, the most famous 3 words, Mutagur gets on the mic, back to Dayan, Har HaBayit biyadenu. You want to cry. Har HaBayit biyadenu. The Temple Mount. It's under our control. Dayan sees an Israeli flag from the binoculars flying over Har HaBayit. He goes nuts. You take that flag down. Court-martial? I'll come there myself. I'll rip your freaking head off your shoulders. What do you want, World War III? Get that flag down. So the famous picture with the flag on Har HaBayit, it was all about 5 minutes. Now, Yoel Ben Nun, he's a boy who grew up learning Masechta Midot, Masechta Tamid. Har HaBayit. He's the first Jew in 2,000 years that's been on Har HaBayit, in Makam HaMikdash. I mean, the rest of them, most of these guys grew up on socialist or communist kibbutzim. You got to understand, these are guys, they They were eating basar lavan on Yom Kippur. You guys have, unfortunately, many of our children, what do they have on the walls? LeBron James, right? They had pictures of Joseph Stalin. I'm not joking you. These were richtige socialists. They all knew one thing. They heard from their grandmothers, from their grandfathers. They all heard about what? The Kotel Hamaravi. So they asked the Arabs to take them down to the Kotel. They go down the Mugrabi gate. And you know what they find? Ashba. Terrible. Disgusting. The Jordanians turned it into a dump. There were these shanties there. Garbage was dumped there. They start cleaning it out. And Rabbi Goren is with them. And you all know the famous picture with him with the shofar? I found out the truth behind that story. This lion of a man, he was a great Baal Tokeah. He was so choked up he couldn't get a sound out. The picture of him, he couldn't get a sound out. One of the boys had to take the shofar, and he blew the shofar. Goren recomposed himself, Rabbi Goren, and he takes these socialist boys, these communist boys, the members of the 55th Brigade, and he teaches them how to say the Kaddish. Who are they saying Kaddish for? All their friends who've been killed. All their friends who have left orphans and widows. And they say Tehillim, and it's Hallel. And you know that story. King Hussein hears what happens. He's lost the holy places. He's lost Al-Quds. He gets on the phone to the Jordanian legionnaires. The Jordanian legionnaires were the best fighters of Jordan, and they had a personal oath of loyalty to the king himself. He says, get back here. Cross the river. Get back to Amman. We'll have an insurrection. This is the third miracle of our story. If you don't get back here, they'll overthrow the kingdom. They retreat. When the regular Jordanian soldiers see the legionnaires, the best fighters, all withdrawing and retreating and going across the river, they start retreating. By Wednesday afternoon, all of Yehuda, the Judean hills, we conquer. There was no fight in Bethlehem, no fight in Hebron, because the Jordanians abandoned it. It should have taken weeks or months. There would have never been a war because the UN would have shut it down. It was all ours by Wednesday afternoon. Going north into the Shomron, Matei Binyamin in the Shomron, there were some Jordanian soldiers there still fighting, but 80% of the troops there had abandoned. And not only that, thousands of Arabs living there had started fleeing over with following the soldiers. By Thursday morning, Israel is no longer 9 miles wide. Israel is now something which is defensible. Before Thursday morning, you could have stood on the high point with a handheld RPG. You could have taken down a plane trying to land in Lod Airport. Now Israel's, it's tenable. The Soviets were pulling their hair out. This was the biggest humiliation. They'd been bragging how they and the nations that they had trained were going to show their dominance. And they were humiliated. The Israeli army had taken over, opened up the Straits of Tiran now. We could bring petroleum ships in. We could bring in petroleum to fuel for the army, to fuel for everything into Eilat Port. The Egyptians, by the thousands, are running barefooted. There's images of hundreds and thousands of Egyptian soldiers with their hands on their heads and bare feet. General Amir is in a state of depression because he's destroyed his country. Jordan has just lost the whole west bank of the Jordan River. Fascinating story. A Jew by the name of Arthur Goldberg, who by rights should have been a Supreme Court Justice of the United States. And he was asked, please, this was not at all discrimination, please, we need you to take one for the team. We want you to serve as the United States representative, the ambassador to the United Nations. He was so hurt and so upset. He took it, but he really wanted to be a Supreme Court Justice. This was the hand of the Ribbono Shel Olam. because Arthur Goldberg was a Zionist. And he jerked around, and he delayed, and he negotiated, and he dragged this thing out 4 days. And he said to the Israelis, I can't push this off anymore. We can't. So Israel's ready to accept a ceasefire on Thursday. And to give you a background, the head of the Northern Command, General David Elazar, Dado, you know him from the Yom Kippur War, was the chief of staff of the IDF. Dado is sitting there for 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, taking barrages of bombs from the Syrians. They had evacuated the children, the women. Anyone who was left was living in a bomb shelter. And he's screaming and yelling, give me the green light. These boys want the green light. Let us fight. And Dayan had said, no. And you understand why Dayan said no. I got to fight on the East Bank from the Jordan. I got to fight in the south from Egypt. I'm not starting a third war. As long as the Syrians do not cross the border, as long as Syrian troops don't come in and try to take land, then suck it up. Take the hit. I know it's not pretty. I know it's not nice. I don't want a third war. Dado Elazar, the general of the Northern Command, he drove all the way down from the Galilee to, they called the Bor. You know what I mean by the Bor? In Tel Aviv. The command headquarters of the defense establishment. And he's pleading with the president, with the prime minister. He's pleading with Eshkol, give me the green light. And Dayan won't do it. Absolutely not. You know what it's like? Look at the population that we have to take care of. I don't have the soldiers to spread out. No. And they're going to stop this thing anyways. The UN's going to shut it down. No. What happens in New York on Thursday afternoon? I think it's about 1 p.m. Thursday afternoon in New York, which means it's 8 p.m. here. Everything's planned. It's going to be a ceasefire. The Egyptian ambassador gets up and addresses the United Nations. Ceasefire? Ceasefire? Do you know what ceasefire means? It means you stop where you are and I stop where I am. Oh no. These stinking Jews, they're going to give back every stinking inch they've stolen from us. Every square meter they've stolen from us. And they're going back to where they were before Monday morning. There's no ceasefire here. Then the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations gets up and he gives the same drasha. They said, you should have seen the Soviet ambassador to the UN. The guy was pulling his hair out. This nightmare, this humiliation for the Soviet Union is going to keep going on. These idiots, these morons don't want to, cut your losses. No, they want more. And it's our equipment, and it's our billions that we've invested. And they said, you had to look at this guy. Because they were supposed to follow all according to plan. So they're reporting what's happening. They report there's no ceasefire. Dayan calls up Dado Elazar, who's up there in the northern Galilee. He says, Dado, he says, let me play you some music. This will be music to your ears. They don't want a ceasefire. The Egyptians and Syrians want to keep fighting. Tomorrow morning, which will be Friday morning, you can take the ridge. You can try it. I don't have a lot to help you. I don't have much to give you. My people are spread all over the Sinai. They're spread all over the west bank of the Jordan River. But I'll give you what I got. So Dado Elazar says to him, he says, Moshe, he says, that's the sweetest music anyone's ever sang to me. We're not waiting until tomorrow morning. We're going now. Now, please understand one thing. Please understand one thing. We've all gone up now on these paved roads in an Egged bus, and your ear is cracking going 10 miles an hour, right? These guys were scaling mountains with how many kilograms on their back? In the dark of night, they're scaling the mountain from the Galilee up to the Golan Ridge. And they know they're committing suicide because when they get to the ridge, they don't know where, but they know that the Syrians are entrenched in these bunkers with Soviet military attachés. They get there at the crack of dawn. We said that the bloodiest battles, the largest number of casualties was the battle for Jerusalem. The second largest was for the Golan Ridge, the Golan Heights. And it was bloody Friday morning. A lot of Syrians died. A lot of Israelis, a lot of Jewish boys died in that fight. Big time. There's the Golani Museum up there in the Galil. You can see the memorial to them. Friday morning by about 11 a.m., they'd conquered the ridge. The bunkers they'd cleaned out. And the surviving guys said, our friends, they didn't die for 50 meters or for 70 meters. We're moving forward. Can you imagine this? These guys had been climbing all night. These guys had been fighting all morning. They lost half their platoon. They're moving forward. The fourth miracle. I would say the fourth miracle is what happened at the UN on Thursday. The fifth miracle. You know what the fifth miracle was? It was a repeat of what Jordan did on Wednesday. When word gets messaged back to the Syrians, to Damascus, that we've lost the Golan Heights, we've lost the ridge. They said, retreat, you got to defend. Because how far is Damascus from the Golan Heights? 60 kilometers? Not very far. You got to retreat. You got to defend Damascus. The Syrian army retreated. We took it. Quneitra, Katzrin. The Golan Heights was there for the taking, the way that Judea was, the way that Samaria was on Wednesday and Thursday. The Soviets, the Russians, they're going crazy. And they announced to the world, games are over. We are sending naval aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean, and we are coming, and we are going to put a stop to this thing. Now, you got to understand, it's one thing for Israel to fight Egypt without an air force. It's one thing to fight Jordan. It's another thing to fight the Soviet Union. And this is what they announced to the world on Friday evening. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, with 3 words, turned around the whole relationship that the United States of America had with Israel. Against all of his advice from his cabinet, because he felt terribly guilty. He let Israel down. When they needed him, he wasn't there, and he felt terrible. He got on the phone to the Admiral of the United States Navy. He said, this is your Commander-in-Chief. This is the President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Where is the United States 6th Naval Fleet? And the Admiral responded, Commander-in-Chief, President Johnson, the 6th Naval Fleet is about 200 kilometers off of Cyprus. His response, turn it around. Turn it around. And he let the world know that the 6th Naval Fleet in the United States of America was coming into this fight. Don't start with a Texan, folks. You know what I mean? He stood up to the Soviet. Now, probably his own Democratic Party, the Republicans, they wanted to kill him for that. But he did this. We don't know what would have happened. We don't know. Because America got on the phone to Israel. We announced to the world we're coming in. But let me tell you something, boys. No stories. I don't want to hear the Syrians are shooting and they won't stop shooting. No Chad Gadya, no Dayenu, no Manishtana, no stories, guys. We don't want World War III. We don't want World War III. Put an end to this thing. So they said the following. Can you get us, delay it in the United Nations, delay it till 11 a.m. New York time. He said to Goldberg, well, you're going to have to use your legal skills and your negotiating skills. Can you delay this thing till 11 a.m. Shabbos morning, New York time, the 11th of June? They declare that there'll be a ceasefire at 11 a.m. What's 11 a.m. in Israel? 6 p.m., right? Moshe Dayan calls Dado Elazar. He says, Dado. He says, you got till 3 p.m. He says, I don't care if they're killing our guys. Not one shot. Not one offensive. Not one response. Nothing after 3 p.m. Now, why do you tell them 3 p.m.? It's like a rabbi, right? You tell the rabbi he's got 15 minutes to talk. You're looking at a 40-minute drasha, you know? You tell a Jewish general, you got till 3 p.m. Maybe he'll stop by 6 p.m. That's why, Moshe Dayan knew the characters he was working with. 2:33, 2:34 p.m., Shabbos afternoon, June 11th. An Israeli flag is staked on the Hermon mountain. Not so you and I could go on a ski vacation. Why'd they do that? Do you remember a few years ago when the Syrians dammed up the Chezbani and dammed up the Banyas? Never again. That melting snow and melting ice off of the Hermon mountain range that provided the only water for our nation, we're going to be in control of our destiny. Not the Syrians, not the Soviets, not anybody else. Only God Almighty. And these boys in the last day of the war risked their lives, were moser nefesh, to get the Hermon. They didn't get all of it, but they got the most crucial part of the Hermon mountain range. The war ended. In 6 days, we went from a country that was 9 miles wide to being over 3 times the size of what it was 6 days earlier. We went from an annihilation, from the second Shoah in a quarter of a century, to the greatest miracle in Jewish history since Hanukkah, maybe since Yetzias Mitzrayim. One of the people I interviewed was Natan Sharansky. And I want to share with you what he said. He said to me, you have to understand something. You have to understand this. We were self-hating, self-loathing Jews. I had no idea why I was a Jew. All I knew is I had this stinking I on the identity card. Ivrei, like Ivri, Hebrew. They hated us. We didn't even know why they hated us, but they hated us, we hated ourselves. And he said, you know something? Before the 6-Day War, we assumed it was all Soviet propaganda until we watched the footage of these Israelis digging sandbags and building bunkers. And we knew these people, who supposedly were our brothers and sisters, we knew they were in trouble. We knew it was bad. And he said, after the war, after they bragged how they were going to, the Soviet military might was going to do to Israel what was being done in Vietnam, they hated us even more. They hated us even more. But you know what? Instead of them mocking us, despising us, they respected us. This is Sharansky talking. They respected us because we were the representatives of the Jews, of the Ivrei, the Jewish state. And he said, I got to tell you something. When they started to respect us, for the first time in our lives, we started to respect ourselves. He says, in 1989, 1990, after Perestroika and Glasnost, when the Iron Curtain fell, and as Elie Wiesel used to refer to them, the prisoners of silence, you wouldn't have had 1 million people coming to Israel. They wouldn't have been left as Jews. He said, the Hebrew classes, the prayer services, the Chumash, Talmud classes, the Jewish history lessons, all of the secret meetings that became the Soviet Jewry movement, that became this whole Refusnik movement. He says all of it was a function of the 6-Day War. I don't remember then, but I'm quoting many people I interviewed. Unless you were a Satmar Chassid in Williamsburg An American Jew didn't walk on the street with a kippah on their head. A British Jew, a Canadian Jew did not walk on the street with a kippah on their head. After the Six-Day War, there was a pride. Started to wear a kippah. The whole Baal Tshuva movement in America. What was the catalyst for the Baal Tshuva movement in America? Today in American Orthodoxy, 29 out of 100, only 71 were raised in an Orthodox house. 12 grew up in a conservative home, 8 grew up in a reform home, 8 grew up in a home of no affiliation, 2 are converts, Jews by choice. Where did that come from? That whole movement back to Yiddishkeit. The Six-Day War was the catalyst for that. There was a pride in being a Jew. I'll tell you something else of people that I interviewed. You know what Holocaust survivors told me? After 1945, they couldn't have a relationship with their religion, with their God. They were a Jew because they were a Jew by default. Not because they could embrace or understand what happened from 1939 to 1945. How could a God allow this to happen? They kept asking themselves. When they saw what happened in those 6 days, what should have happened and what happened, they knew God had not abandoned the Jewish people. God had not rejected the Jewish people. There was a God of history. There was a God of providence. And I can't tell you how many survivors said their return to their God, their return to their religion, their return to their Masorah was a consequence of the Six-Day War. Bibi Netanyahu, I didn't have the chance to interview him, but I watched this. He said this. Before 1967, it was Israel. The focus of the Jewish homeland wasn't, because the history of the Jewish people we didn't have. No Bethlehem, no Hebron, no Yerushalayim. This is not Yerushalayim. Thank God we call it Jerusalem. This is not halachic Yerushalayim. Jews never lived here. Thank God we're here. But the Yerushalayim, the Bethlehem, the Hebron, the Shechem, nothing. What happened? After June of 67, it wasn't just Israel. The Jews had returned. The first time in the annals of all of human history, the first time in the history of humanity that a refugee people, after 2 millennia, after 2,000 years as refugees, had returned to their homeland, to their capital city, to their holy places. It became Jewish. How many yeshivot exist in the old city in the Iratika? How many, that whole revival, I can tell you, one of the people interviewed, Rabbi Greenblatt, he passed away. He said if you wanted to talk to the Brisker Rav, or you wanted to talk to the Chazon Ish, there weren't too many people learning Torah. You could walk in and tell them a shtickle Torah. Today, you try to get near a gadol like that, you got lines out the door. You got to have protection with the shamish. Those days, he said, it was easy, nothing. Today, never before in Jewish history have we had this many people studying full-time in Jewish education. Women, men, yeshivot, ulpanot. That was all consequence of the Six-Day War. That people that almost had been annihilated 20-some years earlier, that couldn't take a second annihilation. That people now had a land that was sustainable. That people now had a homeland. Now had fulfilled the words of Yeshaya and Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel. Had fulfilled the words of Zechariah. That people had come home after 2 millennia. And it led to the Russian Aliyah, the Ethiopian Aliyah. We're still waiting for the American Aliyah. And that people in 1967, if you include Jews, Arabs, and Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, had 2 million people. Today, we just had the census a couple weeks ago. what was it, 8.4 million people. 75% of the 8.4 million are Jews. For the first time since the year 150 or 160, this land has the largest Jewish population of any land on the face of the globe. We've come home. And if, please God, we keep having children and grandchildren, and if God, please God, things happen and Iran does not get nuclear capabilities, you saw the projections? By 2050, they expect over 15 million people on this land. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? That's all a consequence of the greatest event, for sure since Hanukkah, in the last 2,200 years, and I would argue maybe going back to Yetzias Mitzrayim. This Sunday, when we observe Yom Yerushalayim, I'm going to ask you to do something. Not just this Sunday, I'm going to ask it every day. When you say Modim Anachnu Lach, dip a little lower, bow a little deeper. I'll tell you why. My ancestors and your ancestors, in their wildest hallucination, in their wildest dreams, couldn't imagine that we'd have 8.4 million people walking around our homeland, that we would be the high-tech nation of the world, that we would have Jews from all four corners of the world coming back. They couldn't imagine such a thing. I don't know why the Almighty enabled us or chose us to live in this generation, why we're living at this point in history. But every time we pray, Modim Anachnu Lach, we thank the Almighty that God gave us the ability to fulfill the dreams, the greatest wishes, and the greatest imaginations and hopes of our ancestors. And that we're here in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, in the land of Israel. I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos, a wonderful Yom Yerushalayim, and good evening.